Hello, my dear masterminds. They expected you to explain because that's how power usually works. Questions create pressure. Pressure creates movement. Movement creates leverage. Most people rush to fill silence because silence feels like weakness to those who rely on direction. They assumed you would clarify, justify, soften the moment, restore balance. They waited for you to step into the role they assigned without asking. The role of someone who owes context, someone who needs to be understood, someone who can be guided once they start talking. What they didn't account for is that explanation is a form of participation. The moment you explain, you accept the frame. You accept that their question has authority. You accept that the situation requires resolution on their terms. You didn't accept any of that. You stayed silent, not to provoke, not to intimidate, but because nothing inside you required translation. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was accuracy. You understood something they didn't. That explanations don't reduce tension. They shift influence. And you weren't interested in shifting anything. You weren't confused. You weren't caught off guard. You weren't buying time. You simply didn't enter the exchange. And that decision changed the entire dynamic immediately. The silence didn't invite another question. It exposed the first one. It revealed that the demand for explanation wasn't about understanding at all. It was about regaining direction of the moment. When you didn't respond, there was nothing to push against. No emotion to calibrate. No tone to interpret. No weakness to exploit. The room adjusted instead. People shifted in their seats. The urgency drained. The authority behind the question softened. Because silence at that level does something explanation never can. It forces others to confront their own assumptions. They expected you to explain because they believed you were operating inside their system. The silence told them you weren't. Once they realized that, the question itself lost legitimacy. Not because you challenged it, but because it had nowhere to land. They understood something in real time that most people never articulate. An explanation only matters if the other person has the power to demand it. And power only exists where there is emotional dependence. You showed none. You didn't stiffen. You didn't withdraw. You didn't perform confidence. You simply remained still. And stillness, when it isn't defensive, becomes a mirror. They saw themselves in that mirror, the impatience behind the question, the need to resolve discomfort quickly, the habit of pulling others into dialogue to reassert hierarchy. Your silence didn't escalate the moment. It closed it, without drama, without declaration. The follow-up they expected never came, because follow-ups require momentum. Momentum requires engagement. You offered neither. That's why they never asked again. Not because they feared you, because they understood something fundamental had shifted. You weren't refusing to explain. You were demonstrating that nothing required explanation in the first place. And once people sense that a limit exists without being enforced, they don't test it. They respect it instinctively. Silence didn't make you unreadable. It made you unmovable. They replayed that moment later, trying to understand why it ended so cleanly. No raised voices, no tension spilling over, just a question that dissolved the instant it wasn't answered. That's when they recognized the difference between authority that demands response and authority that reveals itself by not needing one. You hadn't withheld information to gain advantage. You had demonstrated that you weren't operating from a position that required approval. Explanation would have placed you inside their timeline, their urgency, their need for closure. Silence placed you outside, all of it. And once someone is outside the frame stops functioning. They noticed how quickly their own certainty drained when there was nothing to react to. How the confidence behind the question depended entirely on your participation. Without it, the structure folded inward. No one filled the gap, because the gap wasn't empty, it was complete. Silence had already done the work. From that point forward, they adjusted how they approached you. Fewer assumptions, fewer demands, less expectation that access came automatically. Not because you enforced distance, but because distance revealed itself. They learned that some people don't need to explain because they aren't asking to be understood. And once that lesson lands, it doesn't need repetition. They never asked again because the answer had already been given. They never asked again because the silence changed how the moment was remembered, not as unfinished, but as resolved. They realized that explanations are usually a negotiation disguised as clarity. Whoever explains is already conceding that the other side gets to evaluate the answer. You never made that concession. You didn't deny them information. You denied the premise that information was owed. That distinction mattered. It's why the dynamic didn't turn hostile. Hostility needs resistance. You gave none. You didn't assert dominance. You removed dependence. And once dependence disappears, questions lose their force. They noticed how quickly the room recalibrated without instruction. People stopped waiting for you to justify yourself. They stopped framing interactions as if they were entitled to context. Silence clarified the boundary more clearly than words ever could. It wasn't a tactic you repeated. It was a state you inhabited. That's why it held. They learned that silence, when it's not defensive, doesn't invite pressure, it concludes it. And conclusions like that don't reopen. What settled after that was something quieter than respect and steadier than tension. Recognition. They understood that the moment hadn't stalled because you were uncertain. It ended because there was nothing to resolve. You weren't withholding an explanation that would eventually arrive. You had already decided that the situation didn't qualify for one. And once people sense that a decision has already been made internally, they stop negotiating. Silence, in that form, isn't absence of communication. It's the clearest signal possible that the exchange has concluded. They felt it immediately. The conversation didn't trail off, it closed. And closures don't invite reopening unless someone wants to reveal themselves again. No one did, because silence had already shown them where the line was, without drawing it. They understood that asking again wouldn't produce answers. It would only confirm that the message had already landed. So they adjusted. Instead, they spoke differently. They approached differently. They measured words before offering them. Not because you demanded it, but because silence had quietly redefined what was appropriate. You didn't need to explain. You didn't need to defend. You didn't need to clarify. The silence handled all of it at once. They expected you to explain because that's what most people do when pressure appears. You chose silence because pressure had no meaning for you. And once they understood that, the question stopped entirely. From that point on, the silence followed you, like a reputation you never announced. Not awkward silence, not avoidance, a specific kind of quiet that signals completion. People adjusted before speaking. They reconsidered whether a question was necessary at all, because they remembered what happened the last time someone expected an explanation and received nothing instead. The silence had taught them something precise. That access is not automatic. That clarity is not owed. That pressure only works when the other person recognizes it as valid. You didn't, and that changed the weight of asking. Every question now carried consequence, not confrontation, but exposure. Because silence doesn't argue back. It reflects the intent behind the question. And most questions, once reflected, reveal more about the asker than the one being asked. They understood that pressing you wouldn't produce information. It would only highlight their need for it. So they stopped. Not out of fear, out of accuracy. They learned that some people don't withhold answers. They simply don't participate in exchanges that don't align with their internal order. You didn't escalate the situation. You concluded it. And once people experience a conclusion like that, clean, wordless, unmistakable, they don't test it again. Silence became the line they respected, without being told to. What remained after that was not distance, but clarity. They didn't walk away thinking you were difficult or evasive. They walked away understanding that explanation is a privilege granted by alignment, not an obligation demanded by position. You never revoked access. You revealed that access had never been established. That's why the silence didn't feel cold. It felt finished. People don't argue with what feels finished. They don't reopen conversations that already resolved themselves internally. You weren't silent to gain advantage. You were silent because nothing in you required validation. And that self-sufficiency changed how every interaction unfolded afterward. They approached you without assumptions. They spoke with precision instead of pressure. They learned, quietly, that some individuals don't need to explain because they are not operating inside anyone else's structure. You didn't assert authority. You demonstrated independence, so complete it made authority unnecessary. That's why they never asked again, not because they were shut down, but because they finally understood. Silence wasn't a refusal, it was a conclusion. And this is what stays long after the moment ends. They no longer confuse pressure with legitimacy. They no longer assume that asking gives them the right to receive. Something fundamental recalibrated in how they read silence itself. They learned that silence isn't always waiting to be filled. Sometimes it's signaling that nothing further is required. You didn't train them with repetition. One moment was enough, because the silence didn't wobble. It didn't soften over time. It didn't turn into explanation later. It held. And things that hold without reinforcement become standards people follow instinctively. From then on, they sensed it before speaking, whether a question belonged in the room at all, whether an explanation was appropriate or intrusive, whether the moment called for words or restraint. You didn't demand that awareness. You established it by refusing to participate in exchanges that assumed entitlement. They expected you to explain because most people do. You chose silence because you understood something most people don't. That explanation gives weight to the question. Silence decides whether the question ever mattered. They never asked again because they didn't need to. The silence had already answered everything that was worth answering. And this is where it ends quietly, without ceremony. They don't carry resentment. They don't carry curiosity. They carry adjustment. The kind that alters behavior without needing reminders. They no longer assume access when silence appears. They no longer confuse expectation with entitlement. They understand now that explanation is not the default state of influence. Silence is not silence born of fear or avoidance, but silence that comes from internal completion. You didn't withhold words to shape the moment. You let the moment show that it didn't shape you. And that distinction stays. It reshapes how they speak to others, how they frame questions, how they measure influence. You didn't dominate the exchange. You stepped outside it. And stepping outside, when it's calm and deliberate, resolves dynamics more cleanly than confrontation ever could. They expected you to explain. You chose silence. They never asked again, because the silence didn't invite continuation. It delivered closure. And closure like that doesn't reopen. It becomes the line people recognize without needing to see it drawn. And the last thing they learned is this: silence, when it comes from certainty, doesn't ask to be respected. It holds on its own. They don't remember your silence as absence. They remember it as weight. The kind of weight that ends momentum instead of redirecting it. They don't think of it as a moment where you chose not to speak. They remember it as the moment the situation stopped having influence over you. That's why it never repeated, because repetition only happens when a dynamic remains unresolved. This one resolved itself instantly. You didn't explain because explanation would have reopened a loop that no longer applied to you. You didn't stay silent to appear strong. You stayed silent because strength wasn't something you were trying to communicate. It was already present. And when presence is complete, words become unnecessary. They expected you to explain because that's what people do when they're inside the frame. You weren't. You chose silence. And in doing so, you showed them exactly where the frame ended. They never asked again because there was nothing left to ask. The moment had already concluded itself. Quietly, cleanly. What never needed words is what finally stayed with them. Not the silence itself, but what it revealed about how influence actually works. They realized that the strongest positions don't negotiate entry. They don't defend themselves. They don't rush to be understood. They simply exist outside the demand to explain. From that moment on, they stopped approaching you as someone who could be guided through dialogue. They understood that conversation only works when both sides need something from it. You didn't. And that absence of need became the clearest signal of all. You weren't withholding truth. You were refusing to convert truth into something that required approval. That's why the silence didn't feel cold or dismissive. It felt complete. Completion doesn't invite follow-up. It closes the loop entirely. They expected explanation because explanation is how most dynamics continue. You chose silence because continuation wasn't required. And once they recognized that, the dynamic ended quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the most decisive way possible. Nothing more was said, because nothing more was necessary. And that understanding doesn't fade into memory. It becomes instinct. They never asked again, not because you shut them down, but because they finally understood. Silence wasn't an answer. It was the conclusion. And this is where it stays settled, without needing reinforcement, They don't tell the story as a confrontation. They don't describe it as tension. They describe it as a moment that simply ended. Cleanly, fully. The silence didn't create distance. It created orientation. They learned where they stood without being told. They learned what wasn't available without being denied. You didn't claim authority. You demonstrated that authority wasn't required. From then on, they approach moments differently. They listen for alignment instead of demanding explanation. They recognize when a question is a request for influence disguised as curiosity. They sense when silence means the exchange is already over. You didn't teach them with words. You taught them by not entering the negotiation at all. And lessons learned that way don't get debated. They get absorbed. They expected you to explain because most people do. You chose silence because you understood something deeper. Not every moment deserves continuation. Not every question deserves access. And once that understanding is felt, not explained, it stays. They never asked again because there was nothing left to ask. The silence had already done what words never could. What remains after everything else falls away is not silence as an action, but silence as a condition. They don't remember the words that weren't said. They remember how the moment stopped responding to them, how the familiar processes no longer produced results, how expectation gradually lost its influence without being challenged. You didn't withdraw. You didn't disengage. You stood exactly where you were, and the situation adjusted itself around that stillness. That's why it never repeated. People don't persist where effort produces no response. They don't ask where asking only reveals their own need. They don't pursue what clearly isn't participating. You didn't establish separation by declaring it. You made the separation visible by never stepping into their frame at all. And once that's seen, it doesn't invite curiosity. It invites restraint. From then on, silence around you isn't awkward. It's understood. It signals that the exchange has concluded before it began. They expected you to explain, because explanation keeps interaction moving. You chose silence, because you were already outside that exchange. And when someone exits that cleanly, the structure adjusts instead. Quietly, steadily. Nothing else needs to be said, because nothing else would add clarity. The silence had already completed its role.